On a cold November night in 1981, the waters near Santa Catalina Island carried the body of a woman who had once been Hollywood's brightest star. Natalie Wood, beloved actress and symbol of fragile beauty, was found floating lifeless in the Pacific, leaving behind whispers, questions, and shadows that have never fully lifted. Welcome, dear listener, wherever you find yourself in this vast world tonight. Perhaps you are resting in the quiet of your home, or listening beneath the stars, or letting these words guide you into the stillness of sleep. I invite you to leave a comment about when and where you are listening, so that your memory may join others in this circle across the globe. If you wish to support this journey through time, I ask gently that you press the subscribe button, so that these voices from history may continue to live on. So let us begin, slowly and without haste, to trace the life of Natalie Wood, not in the manner of a ledger or a courtroom testimony, but as one might walk along a winding path, stopping to touch the stones, to notice the flowers, to hear the faint music of another era. Her story begins long before that final night at sea, when she was not yet Natalie Wood, but Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko, a child with wide eyes and a destiny written, it seemed, by both fortune and misfortune. The story of Natalie Wood begins not on the ocean but beneath the glow of California's sun, though her roots were far from those shores. She was born in San Francisco in July of 1938, the daughter of Russian immigrants whose lives had been shaped by the tides of revolution and exile. Her parents, Nikolai and Maria, carried with them memories of another land, a homeland left behind in the turmoil after the fall of the old empire. They arrived in America with hopes of survival and reinvention, yet within their home clung the atmosphere of a people displaced, voices speaking in Russian, customs preserved like relics, and the weight of dreams deferred. Maria, her mother, was a woman of strong will and unyielding ambition. She saw in her daughter's delicate face not merely innocence but possibility. Perhaps it was the gleam in Natalia's eyes, or the way her tears seemed so real when she played, that persuaded Maria to believe her child was destined for the screen. The mother, who had once longed for the stage herself, took upon her the role of guide and guardian, determined to secure for her daughter the success that fate had denied her. The child was scarcely more than 4 when she first stepped before a camera. She stood amid the hum of machines and the hot glare of studio lamps, her small frame lost among towering adults. Yet when the director asked for her to weep, she did so with such sincerity that the room fell still. The artifice of cinema seemed for a moment to dissolve, and there remained only a child whose sorrow was entirely believable. Thus began her life as an actress, though she was still learning the alphabet, still forming the outlines of her own identity. The name Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko was soon judged unsuitable for Hollywood. It was deemed too foreign, too difficult for American tongues. And so she was given a new name, one that rolled easily across billboards and theater marquees: Natalie Wood. A name polished, trimmed of its origins, easier to remember, easier to sell. In this transformation lay both promise and wound. For while the new name granted her entry into the world of American cinema, it also severed her, in a sense, from the ancestry that had shaped her blood and bone. She would always be, in part, the child of Russian émigrés, yet to the public she became an all-American starlet. As a child star, Natalie found herself surrounded by adults who measured her worth in how well she could serve the story on screen. She was praised for her naturalness, for the way she could cry convincingly without coaxing. But behind each performance stood her mother, often urging her, sometimes with whispered threats, to give the director exactly what he desired. There are stories told of Maria whispering frightening tales into Natalie's ear just before a scene, so that real fear would show in her eyes. To the viewer, it was art. To the child, it was obedience mingled with confusion. The lines between self and performance blurred from the very start. One of her earliest remembered roles was in the 1947 classic Miracle on 34th Street, where she played the skeptical little girl who learns to believe in Santa Claus. The film became a holiday treasure, revisited by families year after year. Yet for Natalie, it was another step deeper into the labyrinth of fame. Audiences saw her as charming, earnest, and precocious. Few wondered at what cost such poise came to a child barely 9 years old. In those years, she became the breadwinner for her family. While other children played in parks or learned to ride bicycles, Natalie was learning her lines, attending photo sessions, traveling from set to set. The household relied upon her earnings, and thus the burden of responsibility pressed upon her small shoulders. Fame, so glittering from the outside, carried within it the weight of necessity. She could not stop, for to stop would mean to disappoint not only her mother, but the entire family structure that leaned upon her success. What must it have felt like, to be so young and yet so bound? Was she ever free to discover who she might have been, had the camera not claimed her? Or was she always, from the moment those studio lights first touched her, shaped into something other than herself? Such questions linger as one looks back upon her early career. By the time Natalie reached her teenage years, she had already appeared in over a dozen films. She was no longer the wide-eyed child, but a girl on the cusp of womanhood, her features maturing, her roles shifting accordingly. Hollywood, ever hungry for new faces, saw in her the possibility of transition from child actress to leading lady. Yet such a passage is fraught with peril. Many child stars are discarded when they grow, their innocence no longer sellable, their awkward years ill-suited for glamour. But Natalie possessed a quality that endured, a mixture of vulnerability and quiet strength, a gaze that suggested hidden depths. She began to attract roles that spoke to adolescence itself, its confusions, its longings. It was in these years that she came to the attention of directors who would recognize her potential not merely as a charming child, but as a serious actress. The seeds of her later triumphs were being sown even then, and still, within her, was the child who had once stood weeping beneath the glare of studio lamps. Did she remember that first moment when the applause echoed and she realized her tears were no longer her own? Did she feel even then the strange emptiness that comes when one's truest feelings are borrowed for the entertainment of strangers? As we linger upon these beginnings, one image rises above the rest. A small child standing upon a soundstage, eyes wide, face illuminated by lights brighter than the sun, gazing not at the director, not at the camera, but into a space beyond, as though she could already sense that her life would forever be lived in the gaze of others. The echo of that first applause seemed to follow her everywhere, a sound that never truly faded. The applause lingered in her ears, long after the lights dimmed and the stagehands departed, a sound that seemed to follow her even in dreams. It was not the gentle clapping of family gathered in a living room, nor the warm cheer of children at play, but a louder, more insistent sound, one that belonged to strangers seated in theaters, strangers who did not know her name, only the face projected before them. And so, from her earliest years, applause was both a balm and a chain, a reassurance of worth, and a reminder that her life was never wholly her own. As the 1940s closed and the 1950s dawned, Natalie's place as a child star seemed secure. Yet each film demanded from her something deeper than her years might suggest. To play a child who doubted magic and was taught to believe required not merely a smile, but the subtle art of transformation. And though she performed with natural grace, she was guided by a firm and sometimes merciless hand. Maria, her mother, did not allow for hesitation. If the director required tears, Maria found a way to summon them. Sometimes she whispered threats. Sometimes she spoke of family harm, painting dark pictures that a sensitive child could not resist. Natalie's sobs, so moving upon the screen, were often rooted in fear rather than artistry. The world saw talent, but behind the camera lay something more complex, the blurred boundary between performance and compulsion. Hollywood in those years had no true shield for children. They were seen as miniature adults, expected to endure long hours, to follow instructions, to perform without complaint. Natalie was no exception. She rose early for school lessons on set, memorized lines submitted to endless takes, and carried herself with a poise that made audiences believe she was wise beyond her years. But what becomes of a child taught to conceal fatigue, to swallow her own desires for the sake of others' ambitions? One wonders whether each smile concealed a question she dared not voice. Still, even amid the exhaustion, there were moments of wonder. The sets were like dream worlds. Streets built indoors, houses crafted with delicate artifice, snow conjured from machines. For a child, these sights were both enchanting and bewildering. Natalie was praised for her ability to step into these worlds without hesitation, to believe in them as if they were real, and in this, she found a strange kind of joy. Perhaps she understood more deeply than others that belief itself is a form of magic. Yet the applause remained always in the distance, reminding her that her joy was not private, but purchased. As she grew older, the transition from child to adolescent was watched closely by studio executives. They weighed her future, as one might weigh the ripeness of fruit, wondering whether she would blossom into beauty or be discarded as another child actor whose time had passed. Such scrutiny might have crushed another, but Natalie bore it with the same quiet grace that had defined her earlier years. She studied herself in mirrors, sensing already the expectations that surrounded her. She was no longer just a child. She was becoming an image, a vessel for others' dreams. Her breakthrough into adolescence came with roles that reflected the very turmoil of her own years. In one, she portrayed a girl confronting the confusion of first love. In another, a child caught between innocence and awakening. These roles were not mere fictions, but reflections of her own passage. And in performing them, she gave to audiences what she herself was living. It is perhaps here that her gift was most profound, for she did not simply act, but embodied the trembling line between childhood and adulthood, carrying into her performances the authenticity of lived experience. And yet, within her household, the weight of her earnings pressed heavily. She was not free to falter. Her family depended upon her, and her mother's eyes watched her every move. Maria's will was strong, her belief in Natalie's destiny unshakable. But such faith can be both a blessing and a burden. Did Natalie feel pride at supporting those she loved, or did she quietly resent that her playtime was stolen, her choices narrowed? The answer may lie buried in the silence she kept, the silence of a child who rarely dared to speak her heart. It was during these adolescent years that she first encountered the strange intimacy of Hollywood friendships. Fellow child actors became companions, yet they too were caught in the same web, their lives defined by contracts and appearances. Among them, she found both camaraderie and competition, for each child was measured not simply as a person, but as a commodity. In this way, even friendship was shadowed by comparison. One of the earliest signs of Natalie's enduring power as an actress was her ability to evoke empathy. Audiences did not merely admire her, they felt for her. They sensed in her expressions, in the slight tremble of her voice, a vulnerability that mirrored their own hidden feelings. This quality would remain with her throughout her career, shaping the roles she chose and the way she was remembered. But for now, it was simply the truth of a child who had learned to reveal pain without words. As the 1950s unfolded, her path led toward a destiny greater than anyone had foreseen. Soon she would meet James Dean. Soon she would stand upon sets where youth itself was being redefined. Soon she would embody the restless spirit of a new generation. But in these early years, she was still learning to carry the applause, still hearing it echo in the quiet of her nights. The image lingers, a young girl, half child and half woman, standing in the darkened corridor of a studio, the scent of paint and dust in the air, listening as distant applause fades into silence. She holds her script in trembling hands, knowing that tomorrow she will be asked again to become someone else, to weep or to smile on command. And she wonders, perhaps only for a moment, if anyone will ever know the difference between the tears she gives to the world and the tears she keeps for herself. The tears she kept for herself were the ones no camera ever captured, the quiet moments when the applause had faded and the lights no longer glared upon her. They lingered in the silence of her room, in the long car rides home when her mother spoke not of play, but of the next audition, the next opportunity, the next step upon the path that seemed to stretch endlessly forward. Those hidden tears, unseen by audiences, were perhaps the truest part of her, for they belonged not to performance, but to solitude. Yet even those private emotions shaped the girl who would soon become the actress of a generation's restlessness. By the mid-1950s, Natalie was on the threshold of a transformation. She was no longer the child who charmed audiences in holiday films, nor the innocent face that studios placed upon sentimental posters. She was now a young woman of 16, her features sharp with new beauty, her voice gaining depth, her eyes carrying a gravity beyond her years. It was at this tender age that she found herself cast in a film that would not only alter her career, but also etch her name into the mythology of American cinema. Rebel Without a Cause. The film was more than a script, more than a series of scenes to be performed. It was the portrait of a generation caught between tradition and upheaval, a tale of disillusioned youth searching for meaning in a world of absent parents and silent authority. James Dean, with his brooding presence and restless energy, embodied the voice of rebellion, a voice that resonated with teenagers across the nation. Alongside him stood Natalie, portraying Judy, a young woman yearning for love and recognition, torn between defiance and vulnerability. On screen, the connection between Dean and Wood was electric, not in the manner of romance alone, but in the shared recognition of wounded souls. Dean, with his own troubled past, carried an authenticity that required no performance. Natalie, who had learned since childhood to offer her emotions as currency, matched him not with mimicry, but with genuine resonance. Their scenes together carried a tension that felt almost too real, as though two lost beings had found in each other a mirror of their longing. Behind the camera, the bond between the young actors was equally intense. Both were caught in the strange paradox of Hollywood, admired by millions yet often profoundly alone. Dean's restlessness found in Natalie a kindred spirit, and she, in turn, found in him someone who understood the weight of expectation. Sal Mineo, their co-star, added to this trinity of youthful searching, and together they formed a circle that seemed both fragile and eternal, a brief constellation of stars burning brightly for a moment before scattering into the dark. It is said that Natalie's role in Rebel Without a Cause marked the first time she was taken seriously as an actress. Until then, she had been regarded as a child star, her future uncertain. But her performance as Judy revealed depths of emotion and intelligence that critics could not ignore. The Academy itself took notice, nominating her for an Oscar. For Natalie, it was a turning point, a confirmation that she was not merely a face, but a force, capable of embodying the complexity of human desire and despair. And yet, even as she stood upon this new threshold, the applause once again echoed in her ears, both sweet and unsettling. For recognition brings with it not only praise but also expectation. And Natalie, still barely out of girlhood, was thrust into the role of serious actress, icon of youth, and symbol of a restless age. Did she feel pride in her achievement, Or did she sense the beginning of another weight pressing upon her shoulders? Was she free to rejoice, or did she know, deep within, that the applause was never truly for her, but for the image she had become? The death of James Dean shortly after the film's release cast a long shadow over her memory of those days. He died in a car crash at the age of 24, leaving behind not only unfinished roles, but also an enduring myth of youth cut short. For Natalie, his absence was more than the loss of a colleague. It was the loss of a friend who had understood her in ways few others did. The suddenness of his departure reminded her, perhaps too soon, of the fragility of life, of the way brilliance can vanish in an instant. The film itself became a cultural touchstone, revisited endlessly by audiences who saw in it their own struggles and sorrows. And at the heart of it was Natalie, her performance both tender and fierce, capturing the essence of a girl searching for love amid confusion. It was not merely acting, it was truth. Truth born from her own unspoken tears, truth that resonated because it was not entirely invented. From that moment onward, Natalie could no longer be dismissed as a relic of childhood stardom. She was now a leading actress, desired by directors, admired by critics, and adored by audiences. Her transition had been successful, yet with success came a new set of challenges. For in Hollywood, to rise is to invite scrutiny, and to be admired is often to be misunderstood. In the years that followed, Natalie's path would continue upward, leading her to films that explored the intensity of young love and the turbulence of desire. But always, beneath the glamour, lay the memory of hidden tears. The sense that behind the applause there remained a young woman, searching for her own reflection, wondering whether she could ever separate her true self from the roles she played. As the final reels of Rebel Without a Cause flickered in theaters, audiences were left with images of young lives cut short, of yearning unfulfilled, of rebellion unanswered. And Natalie, though still alive, seemed already to carry within her the weight of that story, as though Judy's longings had fused with her own. The applause rose once more, echoing across cinemas, yet behind it lingered the silence of loss, the silence of questions left unresolved. And so we end here, with the image of a young woman standing in the shadow of James Dean, the glow of the screen still upon her face, her eyes reflecting both triumph and sorrow. The applause thunders in the distance, but she hears instead the quiet sobs that belong only to herself, the tears that no one else will ever see. The applause faded into sorrow, lingering like the faint echo of a bell long after the sound has ceased. It seemed to follow Natalie wherever she went, reminding her that triumph was never unaccompanied by loss, that every new height carried with it the shadow of absence. In the quiet after Rebel Without a Cause, she felt both celebrated and haunted, lifted up by acclaim yet weighed down by the sudden silence left by James Dean's departure. Perhaps it was in this balance of brightness and grief that her next great performances found their strength, for Natalie's artistry was never born of joy alone, but of the fragile places where joy and pain entwine. The early 1960s became a period of remarkable ascent for her. She was no longer just a young actress with potential, but a fully realized star, chosen for roles that demanded not only beauty, but depth, roles that mirrored the turbulence of her own heart. Among these, two stand above the rest, each capturing a different facet of her spirit, each leaving an indelible mark upon her legacy: Splendor in the Grass and West Side Story. In Splendor in the Grass, she portrayed Deanie Loomis, a young woman whose passion collides with repression, whose love is stifled by the demands of society and family until her very sanity trembles on the edge. The film, directed by Elia Kazan, demanded of Natalie a rawness that left her exposed before the camera. In Deanie's breakdown, audiences saw not only the tragedy of a character, but the unveiling of Natalie's own vulnerability. Her sobs, her trembling hands, her hollow gaze, they were not the manufactured tricks of performance, but the unguarded expressions of someone who had known the weight of expectation since childhood. It was as though all the hidden tears she had kept within herself now poured forth in Deanie's collapse, giving to the screen a truth that could not be faked. Critics marveled at her bravery, at the depth of emotion she conjured, and Natalie herself felt for the first time that she had given something wholly her own. She spoke later of how grueling the role had been, how close she felt to breaking under the strain, yet also of how liberating it was to offer her pain without disguise. It was as if Deanie's sorrow allowed her to release years of unspoken feeling, to transform her own struggles into art. The performance earned her yet another nomination for an Academy Award, affirming her as one of the foremost actresses of her generation. If Splendor in the Grass revealed her inner turmoil, West Side Story unveiled her as an icon of love and longing. As Maria, the innocent girl who falls into forbidden love amid the violence of rival gangs, Natalie embodied a different kind of vulnerability, one suffused with purity and tragic inevitability. The film itself was a grand spectacle, a reimagining of Romeo and Juliet set against the streets of New York, filled with music and dance, color and motion. Natalie's voice was dubbed in the songs, yet her presence on screen was radiant, her expressive eyes carrying the story's heart. The romance of Tony and Maria, doomed from the beginning, seemed to resonate with Natalie's own life, as though she, too, understood the sweetness and sorrow of love, shadowed by forces beyond control. In her gentle smile, in her tear-filled gaze as fate closes in, audiences felt again the authenticity that was uniquely hers. Even in a film of sweeping choreography and grand gestures, it was her quiet humanity that lingered most deeply in memory. Together, these two films revealed the paradox at the center of Natalie Wood. She was both fragile and strong, tender yet fierce, capable of portraying innocence while carrying within her the knowledge of sorrow. Her characters were not masks she wore, but reflections of the contradictions she lived. It was as though each role asked of her not invention but revelation, and she answered by offering pieces of her own heart. The success of these films brought her wealth, recognition, and the power to choose her projects. She was photographed endlessly, her face appearing on magazine covers, her name spoken with admiration in every corner of Hollywood. Yet fame, once more, was a double-edged gift. For with it came scrutiny of her personal life, whispers about her relationships, curiosity about her every gesture and glance. In a world where beauty was both her gift and her curse, she was reminded daily that she belonged not only to herself, but to the gaze of millions. And within her heart, amid all the triumph, there remained a quiet question. Who was she truly when the cameras ceased to roll? Was she Maria, innocent and doomed? Was she Deanie, broken and yearning? Or was she someone still unseen, a woman yet undiscovered even to herself? The applause, though sweet, offered no answer. It echoed only, rising and fading, like waves upon a shore that gives no reply. As the 1960s opened before her, Natalie seemed poised for a life of unbroken success. Yet even then, subtle shadows gathered. The studio system that had raised her was beginning to crumble. New directors and new voices were reshaping cinema, and the roles offered to women remained bound by limitations. Still, for the moment, she was radiant, her star burning brightly across the screens of the world. The image that endures from these years is of Natalie as Maria, standing beneath a night sky painted with stars, her voice lifted in the sweetness of first love, her eyes wide with hope, unaware of the tragedy to come. That image, like so many in her career, was both art and prophecy. For Natalie's life, too, would be marked by love shadowed by sorrow, by beginnings that carried within them the seeds of endings. And as the applause rose once again, filling theaters with thunder, she heard it still as she always had, both blessing and burden, reminder and warning, a sound that carried her forward even as it left her, forever yearning for silence. Beneath the painted night sky where Maria once sang of love, Natalie herself began to dream of romance that might carry her beyond the scripts and the applause, toward something enduring and real. For though she lived constantly beneath lights and cameras, she was still a young woman, longing as so many do for the comfort of companionship, for the assurance of being cherished not as an image, but as a soul. It was in this yearning that she encountered Robert Wagner, a fellow actor, a man of striking presence, who would soon become not only her husband, but the axis around which much of her life would turn. Their meeting was like so many in Hollywood, orchestrated by the currents of studios and social gatherings, yet it bore the quality of destiny. Wagner was handsome, charming, already known to audiences for his roles in film and television. Natalie, radiant from her recent successes, seemed his natural counterpart. Together they embodied the dream of a golden couple, the union of two stars whose beauty and fame appeared to mirror each other. To the public, their pairing seemed inevitable, almost scripted, as though the gods of cinema themselves had arranged it. But behind the polished photographs and smiling appearances at premieres, the relationship carried complexities that no magazine spread could capture. Wagner was older by 8 years, more seasoned in the ways of Hollywood, and Natalie, though accomplished, was still seeking to understand herself. She entered the marriage with the innocence of someone who longed for stability, who believed perhaps that love might offer a sanctuary from the restless tides of fame. And yet, what is love when lived beneath the constant gaze of strangers, when each embrace may be captured in print, each quarrel whispered about in gossip columns? The wedding took place in 1957, a spectacle befitting their celebrity, yet within the splendor lay tender sincerity. Natalie, barely 19, seemed to step into her vows with the earnestness of someone who believed in the fairy tale, who wished that life might at last offer her a story not written by others, but by her own heart. Wagner, elegant and composed, seemed to promise the stability she sought. For a time, their union appeared unshakable, the image of Hollywood perfection. They were photographed aboard yachts, arm in arm at award ceremonies, smiling in the glow of flashbulbs. Fans adored them, calling them the perfect couple, the embodiment of glamour and romance. But within the private rooms of their lives, tensions began to stir. Wagner, though devoted, struggled with the shadow cast by Natalie's rising fame. She, in turn, struggled with the expectations of being both star and wife, with the uneasy balance of independence and devotion. Arguments arose, as they so often do, born not only of love but of pride, of jealousy, of the unspoken fears that lurk beneath intimacy. In Natalie's heart, love was not a simple matter. She had grown up with the sense that affection must be earned, that approval came only through performance. Perhaps she carried this into her marriage, seeking always to please, to fulfill Wagner's desires even as she wrestled with her own. Yet a woman cannot live forever in the shadow of another's gaze. She needed to be seen not as a starlet, not as a wife, but as herself. Did Wagner see her truly? Did he understand the depths of her vulnerability, the hidden tears that shaped her? Or did he, like so many others, fall in love with the image, the luminous figure that shone upon the screen? Their quarrels were whispered about in Hollywood, carried in hushed tones from party to party. Some said Wagner's jealousy was fierce, that he could not bear the attention Natalie received from other men. Others said Natalie, restless and ambitious, longed for more than marriage alone could give her. What is true may never be known, for love is a private script, rewritten daily, its meaning often unclear even to those who live it. And yet, amid the storms, there were moments of profound tenderness. Natalie spoke often of how deeply she adored Wagner, of how safe she felt in his presence. Friends recalled their laughter, their shared glances across crowded rooms, the quiet way they touched hands beneath tables. Love, in its truest form, is always a paradox, containing within it both joy and pain, assurance and doubt. Their marriage was no exception. But Hollywood is a place where even love becomes performance. They were expected to appear together, smiling, perfect, untroubled. Their private struggles could not remain wholly private, for every shadow drew the attention of gossip. Slowly, the cracks widened until the weight of expectation and misunderstanding grew too heavy to bear. By 1962, scarcely 5 years after their vows, the marriage dissolved. The golden couple, once adored as eternal, had broken apart. For Natalie, the end of her first marriage was a wound carried deeply. She had believed in the promise of forever, yet forever had proven fragile. She faced the world once again as an individual, admired by millions yet alone within herself. And yet, as often happens, the ending of one chapter opened the way for new beginnings. Her career surged onward, her beauty undiminished, her talent undeniable. But in her heart, the memory of her first love lingered, unresolved, like a melody that fades yet never vanishes entirely. The image that remains from this period is not of the quarrels or the heartbreak, but of two figures beneath a spotlight, holding hands for the cameras, their smiles luminous yet uncertain, as though even they were unsure who was leading, who was following, and whether they walked together toward light or shadow. The applause of the world thundered still, yet beneath it lay the faint sound of something else, the quiet breaking of a promise, the sigh of a dream unfinished. And as Natalie stepped forward into the years beyond, she carried both the memory of love's sweetness and the ache of its loss, a duality that would shape her path again and again. The sigh of a dream unfinished lingered like a soft door closing, leaving behind a silence that seemed at once heavy and hollow. Natalie stepped into that silence with uncertain feet, no longer the radiant half of a golden couple, no longer bound to the man who had been both anchor and storm. The applause of the world still followed her, but now it echoed in a different way, a reminder not of love fulfilled, but of love lost, and of the restless independence that lay before her. In the years after her divorce from Robert Wagner, Natalie entered a chapter of her life marked by both freedom and loneliness. She was admired, sought after, desired by many. Yet within her heart she carried a wound not easily healed. The public saw a woman of poise and beauty, moving gracefully through Hollywood circles. But those who looked closer sometimes glimpsed the shadows beneath her smile, the faint tremor of someone searching for meaning beyond admiration. She pursued her career with renewed intensity, taking on roles that allowed her to explore the complexity of desire, disillusionment, and resilience. In each performance, she poured fragments of her own experience, as though the screen might absorb her pain and reflect it back as art. But away from the cameras, she sought companionship in ways that were less certain, entering into relationships that often mirrored her own inner conflicts. Lovers came and went, some leaving gentle impressions, others stirring scandal, yet none offering the enduring stability she longed for. Among these affairs, whispers grew louder than truths. In Hollywood, every gesture becomes a story, every glance a rumor. Natalie was linked with actors, directors, writers, some confirmed, others inventions of the gossip columns. What mattered less was the accuracy and more the suggestion. For in a world hungry for scandal, truth was often the first casualty. Did she find joy in these fleeting romances, or were they attempts to quiet the loneliness that echoed within her since childhood? Perhaps both, for the human heart seldom moves in straight lines. There were nights when she appeared at parties, radiant in gowns that shimmered under chandeliers, her laughter carrying across rooms filled with smoke and music. To observers, she seemed at ease, yet those who knew her better sometimes noticed how her eyes searched the crowd, as though seeking someone who could see beyond the glitter to the woman beneath. It was not fame she desired, for she already had that in abundance. It was understanding, the rare gift of being known without the need for performance. Her mother remained a presence in her life, still urging, still guiding, though now Natalie was grown and wealthy, less dependent but never entirely free. Maria's ambitions for her daughter had shaped her from the beginning, and though Natalie sometimes resented the intensity of her mother's hold, she also felt bound by loyalty, by gratitude, by the unspoken ties of blood and history. To rebel fully against her mother's will would be to sever something essential, and Natalie, though restless, was never ruthless. As the decade advanced, the changes in Hollywood mirrored her own uncertainties. The old studio system, once rigid and controlling, was crumbling, giving way to new voices, new freedoms, new chaos. Natalie, a product of the studio's discipline, now found herself navigating a landscape less predictable, where roles for women were shifting, sometimes expanding, sometimes vanishing. She fought to find her place in this evolving world, determined not to fade into the background, yet uncertain how to define herself within it. Her independence brought her experiences both liberating and painful. She traveled, she read widely, she sought friendships outside the industry, hoping to ground herself beyond the stage and screen. Yet the patterns of her life, ambition, vulnerability, the pull of love and loss, remained constant. She was, at her core, a woman who felt deeply, who longed for connection, who could not hide her heart even when it might have been safer to do so. The loneliness of these years is not easily measured, for she was never alone in the ordinary sense. There were always suitors, always friends, always admirers. But to be surrounded is not the same as to be understood. In quiet moments when the party had ended and the house lay silent, she sometimes sat by herself, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, wondering if anyone could truly see her beyond the star. And yet, amid this restlessness, she grew. She learned to assert herself more firmly in her career, to negotiate with directors, to choose projects that mattered to her. She was no longer the obedient child on set, weeping at her mother's command, but a woman with her own voice, her own will. This strength, though hard-won, began to shape her future, preparing her for the chapters yet to come. Still, one cannot help but reflect upon the paradox that independence, so often sought as liberation, can also deepen the ache of solitude. For Natalie, these years after Wagner were both a proving ground and a test, a time when she showed the world her resilience, yet inwardly carried questions unresolved. Did she regret the loss of her first marriage? Did she secretly yearn to return to its familiarity, even with its storms? Or did she see it as necessary, a lesson she must endure to find her true self? The answers lie hidden in the folds of her silence, in the spaces between her roles and her appearances. What endures instead are the impressions, the image of a woman stepping into a crowded room, dazzling all with her presence, yet carrying within her the quiet weight of loneliness, the sound of a door closing softly behind her, leaving her in solitude once more, the sight of her eyes, luminous and searching, as though asking questions no one dared to answer. As the applause of audiences continued, she carried forward into new chapters, stronger in some ways, wounded in others, forever balancing the burden of fame with the yearning for love. And though these years were filled with movement, with faces and places, they left behind an aftertaste of silence, a reminder that even in independence, one can still be haunted by the echo of promises lost. The silence that followed her nights of independence carried within it a faint ticking, like the sound of a clock in a quiet house, each moment reminding her that time itself was moving, that youth, so luminous on screen, could not be held forever. Hollywood, too, was changing, its old rhythms faltering, its certainties dissolving. The studio system that had once dictated roles and guarded reputations was crumbling, and in its place rose a new and uncertain order, shaped by daring directors and shifting tastes. For Natalie, who had grown within the carefully controlled world of the studios, this transformation was both an opportunity and a threat. By the late 1960s, the roles that had once come to her with ease began to scatter, elusive as birds startled from their perches. She was still admired, still regarded as beautiful, but the industry's gaze was restless, seeking fresher faces, younger stars, new kinds of stories. The world was shifting toward a rawer realism, a rebellious spirit in film that echoed the cultural upheavals of the time. And Natalie, who had long been adored for her tenderness and poise, now found herself uncertain of her place in this harsher, louder landscape. She took on roles that sought to capture this new mood, yet some fell flat, neither satisfying critics nor audiences. The applause that had once thundered so easily now came in smaller waves, uncertain, as though the world itself was unsure of what it wanted from her. For the first time in her career, she felt the sting of fading relevance, the cold recognition that talent alone does not guarantee longevity in an industry driven by fashion and desire. Yet even in these struggles, Natalie remained luminous. She had not lost her gift for inhabiting characters with sincerity, for revealing vulnerability that touched hearts. What she lost instead was the spotlight's full intensity, which now turned toward others. She watched as a new generation of actresses, Jane Fonda, Faye Dunaway, Barbra Streisand, captured the imagination of audiences. Their styles were bolder, their roles more radical, their images shaped not by studios, but by the turbulent culture of the times. Natalie, caught between two eras, seemed at times to belong fully to neither. In her personal life, these years mirrored her professional uncertainty. She sought stability in relationships, yet restlessness often lingered. Some loves burned briefly, others collapsed under the weight of expectation, and always there remained within her the quiet ache for something lasting. She was admired wherever she went, yet admiration is not the same as devotion, and Natalie's heart longed not for fleeting attention, but for a love that could withstand time's erosion. There were moments, however, when her artistry still shone, moments when the old magic returned. In certain roles, she captured once more the delicate balance of strength and fragility that had defined her. Critics would remark that even if the films faltered, Natalie herself remained captivating. It was as though her presence carried with it an authenticity that no script, however flawed, could erase. She was still Natalie Wood, and that name still held power. But beneath the surface, she sensed that she was moving against the current, struggling to remain visible in waters that flowed swiftly past her. Perhaps it was during these years that the question of identity pressed most heavily upon her. For so long she had been defined by roles: child star, ingenue, leading lady. Now, with each role harder to find, she was forced to ask who she was beyond the screen. Was she still the girl who had once wept beneath the studio lamps? Was she the woman who had loved and lost, who carried within her the shadows of marriage and independence? Or was she something else, someone still undiscovered, waiting beyond the applause? Time itself is merciless in Hollywood. Beauty is praised yet measured, youth adored yet fleeting. Natalie, though still radiant, felt the gaze of the industry shifting toward younger faces. She was only in her 30s, still vibrant, still capable, yet in a world obsessed with novelty. Even a decade can feel like a gulf. This was perhaps the cruelest paradox of her profession, that she was at the height of her wisdom, her depth as an actress richer than ever, yet the roles offered to her diminished. And so she carried on, accepting what came, shaping each role with her honesty, even when the films themselves did not rise to greatness. She traveled. She appeared on television. She sought to keep her presence alive, even as she sensed the tide was no longer fully in her favor. She was not fading into obscurity. She was too beloved for that, but she was no longer at the very center of the world's gaze. The ticking of the clock grew louder in these years, not the literal clock of days and hours, but the deeper clock of time's passing, of careers measured in decades, of beauty measured in glances. Natalie, who had known applause from the age of 4, now listened to its rhythms with both gratitude and apprehension. She knew its sweetness, but she also knew its fragility, how swiftly it could turn into silence. And yet, even in these uncertain times, she did not surrender. She carried herself with grace, appearing at gatherings, offering kindness to those around her, remaining always the figure of dignity and warmth. Those who knew her personally remembered not only her beauty, but her generosity, the way she reached out to others, the softness in her voice. Fame may rise and fall, but character endures, and Natalie's character was one of resilience, of quiet strength amid uncertainty. The image that remains from these years is not of failure, but of persistence. Natalie sitting in a dressing room, the faint scent of powder in the air, adjusting a costume before stepping once more onto a set. Her reflection in the mirror both familiar and strange, as though she were asking herself again who she was becoming. Behind her, the clock ticks softly, marking the passage of time, reminding her that the stage waits, that the cameras will soon roll, that the applause may come again, or not. She rises. She walks forward. She takes her place. And once more she offers herself to the gaze of strangers, uncertain whether they will see her, but determined to give them something true, something real, even if the world no longer listens as intently as it once did. The clock ticks softly in the dressing room, its sound fading into the rhythm of waves beyond memory, waves that seemed always to wash away the footprints of her past. And it was toward those erased traces that Natalie slowly turned, retracing steps that once had led her into both love and sorrow. For amid the shifting tides of her career and the uncertainties of her heart, she found herself drawn again to the man who had once been her husband, Robert Wagner. What had ended in rupture and silence now beckoned her once more, as though the sea itself whispered of unfinished stories, of circles not yet closed. Their reunion seemed improbable to those who remembered the fractures of their first marriage, yet love often moves in patterns that defy reason. Natalie had known other lovers, had sought in others the stability and devotion she longed for, but none had given her the sense of belonging she once felt in Wagner's presence. He, too, had wandered through relationships, yet found himself unable to forget the woman who had been both his companion and his mirror. Time, which had widened the distance between them, also softened the edges of memory, leaving behind not only the pain but also the tenderness that had bound them. When they came together again in the early 1970s, it was as though the years apart had been a pause rather than an ending. Friends and observers spoke of the inevitability of their reunion, as though destiny had simply taken a detour before guiding them back. For Natalie, now older and more certain of herself, the return to Wagner offered the promise of renewed stability, of a second chance to write the story differently. For Wagner, it was the chance to hold again the woman who had haunted his heart long after she had walked away. Their remarriage in 1972 was marked not by the glittering spectacle of their first wedding, but by a quieter, more reflective tone. They were no longer the golden couple of youthful perfection, but two seasoned souls who had known both triumph and disappointment. The world, of course, still watched, still saw in them a pair of stars reunited, but within their hearts the meaning was more intimate. It was not merely a return to what had been, but an attempt to reshape it into something lasting, something resilient. Together they built a home that seemed, at least on the surface, filled with warmth. Natalie, who had long balanced the demands of career and the longing for family, now stepped more fully into the role of mother. She adored her daughters, Natasha and later Courtney, finding in their laughter and innocence a kind of grounding she had rarely known. To see them play, to hear their voices echo through hallways, was to glimpse a life not defined by cameras, but by tenderness. In their presence, she was not Natalie Wood, the star. She was simply Mama, and in that simplicity lay a joy both fragile and profound. Yet even in this renewed union, shadows remained. Wagner's insecurities, Natalie's own restless spirit, the pressures of fame and the scrutiny of the world, all these lingered like distant storms on the horizon. There were quarrels still, moments of jealousy, of misunderstanding. Marriage, even when chosen twice, is never free of conflict. But in their second chapter, they seemed more willing to endure, more determined to preserve what they had regained. Perhaps they knew that love, once lost, is not easily found again, and thus must be cherished even when imperfect. For Natalie, this return to Wagner coincided with a quieter phase in her career. She no longer sought constant roles but chose projects selectively, balancing them with her devotion to family life. Some critics wondered if she was fading, if motherhood had drawn her away from the screen. But those who knew her understood that she had simply shifted her priorities. She'd been working since childhood, carrying the burdens of fame for decades. Now she allowed herself the grace of stepping back, of living a life not wholly dictated by scripts and applause. Still, she remained deeply conscious of her image, of the way the world perceived her. Appearances mattered, not only for her career but for her sense of self. She dressed with elegance, maintained her beauty with care, ensuring that the Natalie Wood the world saw remained luminous. Yet behind that polished exterior was a woman still searching, still questioning. Could she truly find peace in domesticity? Could she balance the roles of actress, wife, mother, and individual without losing herself once more in the expectations of others? Friends recalled evenings at the Wood-Wagner home filled with warmth and laughter, gatherings where Natalie's charm shone as brightly in private as it did in public. She was generous, attentive, quick to notice when someone felt left out, eager to create an atmosphere of inclusion. In such moments, she seemed deeply content, as though she had at last found the harmony she sought. But harmony, like fame, is fleeting. A delicate balance easily disturbed. The image that endures from these years is of Natalie standing at the edge of the ocean with her daughters, her hand clasped with Wagner's, the waves washing gently at their feet. The sea, which had always both drawn and frightened her, stretched endlessly before them, its surface calm, yet concealing unfathomable depths. In that image lies the paradox of her life. The appearance of peace, the reality of uncertainty, the beauty of the moment overshadowed by the mystery of what lay beneath. For though she had returned to Wagner, though she had embraced the role of mother, though she still carried the admiration of the world, the ocean within her remained restless. And in that restlessness lay the seeds of what was yet to come, the questions still unanswered, the fate still waiting beyond the horizon. The sound of her daughter's laughter filled the house like music, drifting down hallways and across gardens, a sound more precious than any applause she had ever known. It was a melody, unbought, unscripted, pure in its spontaneity, and for Natalie it became the anchor of her days. To watch Natasha play, to hold the infant Courtney in her arms, to see their eyes, so full of trust and innocence, was to glimpse a life that had eluded her for so long, a life where love did not need to be earned through performance. In those moments, she was not Natalie Wood, the star of screen and stage, but simply a mother, carrying her children on her hip, soothing their cries in the night, tucking them into bed with gentle whispers. Yet even as she embraced this role with devotion, the world outside continued to remind her of who she had been, of the star whose image still glowed in memory. Directors called, producers offered roles, magazines requested interviews. Sometimes she declined, choosing instead to remain at home to attend to the fragile joys of family life. Other times she accepted, feeling the tug of her old identity, the need to prove she was still present, still capable, still radiant. Thus began the delicate dance of balance, one that countless women before and after her would recognize, though for Natalie the weight of fame made it all the more intricate. She adored her children with a fierce tenderness, yet she also feared for them. Fame, after all, had stolen much of her own childhood, shaping her into an image before she knew herself. She wanted to protect Natasha and Courtney from such a fate, to shield them from the harsh gaze of Hollywood's lights. Yet protection is never complete. The world already knew their names, already photographed their faces, already whispered of their heritage as children of stars. Natalie, vigilant and protective, did her best to build around them a sanctuary, a home where love was steady and unconditional, where laughter was not for cameras, but for itself. Still, there were nights when she lay awake, listening to the gentle breathing of her daughters, wondering if she could succeed. Could she give them the normality she herself had been denied? Or was it impossible, given who she was, given the world she inhabited? These questions circled within her, as persistent as the sound of waves outside. Questions that offered no easy answers. Her relationship with Wagner, too, was touched by the presence of children. Parenthood softened some of their quarrels, drew them together in shared devotion, yet it also heightened their differences. Arguments over discipline, over schedules, over the balance between career and home arose, as they do in any marriage. But beneath these disputes was the undeniable bond of shared love for the lives they had created, and this bond often held them steady when other forces threatened to divide them. In public, Natalie carried herself with poise, smiling for cameras, attending events with her husband, presenting the image of a woman who had it all: beauty, talent, family. In private, she sometimes confessed to friends her insecurities, her exhaustion, her doubts about her ability to juggle so many roles. Yet even in doubt, she remained devoted, pouring herself into the lives of her children with a selflessness that surprised those who had only known her as a star. Her daughters became, in a sense, her truest audience. It was for them she performed the quiet acts of daily life, making meals, reading stories, brushing hair, drying tears. These acts, unseen by cameras, brought her a satisfaction deeper than any award. She spoke often of how motherhood changed her, how it revealed parts of herself she had never known, how it offered her a kind of fulfillment that the screen could not. But the actress within her did not vanish. When she returned to work, she did so with renewed perspective, bringing into her roles the depth of someone who had known both glamour and domesticity, applause and lullabies. Her performances of these years carried a maturity that critics noted, a subtle layering of strength and vulnerability that only life's trials can provide. She was no longer simply the ingenue or the tragic heroine. She was now a woman of experience, carrying into her roles the richness of motherhood, of love renewed, of wounds endured. Still, questions lingered within her. Did she sacrifice part of herself for family? Did she surrender opportunities that might have extended her career at its peak? Or did she, in fact, discover a truer success, one measured not by box office numbers, but by the sound of her daughter's laughter echoing through her home? These questions, like so many in Natalie's life, remain unresolved, suspended between possibility and doubt. The image that endures from this chapter is not of a stage or a set, nor of a glittering gown beneath bright lights, but of Natalie seated on the floor of her living room, her daughters climbing into her lap, their arms around her neck, her smile radiant, not for cameras, but for love itself. Outside, the ocean waves whispered their eternal rhythm, carrying reminders of time's passage, of life's fragility. Yet within that moment, there was a stillness, a sense of completeness she had long sought. And as she listened to her children's laughter, as she held them close, she felt both joy and unease, for even in that sanctuary, the larger world pressed near. The voices of gossip, the expectations of fame, the whispers of old insecurities, all lingered beyond the door, waiting. But for now, within the quiet glow of family, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace. The sound of her daughter's laughter was still in her ears, yet beyond the sanctuary of home, another sound began to rise, faint at first, then louder, like the rustling of unseen voices carried by the wind. These were the whispers of Hollywood, the gossip that swirled endlessly through parties, studios, and columns, a current as constant as the tide. For in that world no life could remain private, no joy untouched by speculation. Even Natalie, who sought to balance motherhood with the fading glow of her career, found herself enveloped by these murmurs, stories that shaped how others saw her, whether true or not. Whispers clung to her name, stories of friendships that grew too close, rivalries that sharpened into quiet hostility, romances real and imagined. In Hollywood, a glance could become a headline, a dinner could become a scandal, a silence could be interpreted as disdain. Natalie, who had lived her whole life under the watchful gaze of others, understood this better than most. She knew that the voices were part of the life she had chosen, or perhaps the life chosen for her long ago when her mother pushed her onto the stage. And yet knowing did not ease the weariness of being spoken of rather than listened to, imagined rather than understood. Among her friendships, there were bonds genuine and deep, forged in shared experiences of fame's burdens. Elizabeth Taylor, for instance, with whom Natalie shared both admiration and rivalry, embodied the same paradox of beauty and scrutiny. They were often compared, sometimes set against one another in whispers of competition, yet beneath it was recognition of a shared struggle that only they could truly understand. To the public, they were rivals, two luminous figures competing for the same roles, the same headlines. To themselves, perhaps, they were companions in endurance, bound by the same invisible chains of expectation. Other friendships brought her comfort, laughter, evenings of joy away from the stage. Yet even here the whispers intruded, twisting kindness into suspicion, inventing dramas that never existed. Natalie's warmth drew people close, yet her beauty and fame often inspired envy, and in envy, gossip finds fertile soil. Did she sometimes weary of these endless tales, wondering if even her truest gestures could ever remain untouched by distortion? Surely she must have, for her longing was always for authenticity, for relationships not built upon images, but upon understanding. There were also the darker whispers, the suggestions of scandal, the hints at affairs with co-stars or directors. Some may have been true, others mere inventions, but once spoken, they clung to her name like shadows that could not be brushed away. To live under such constant scrutiny is to carry an invisible weight, for one's private life is never truly one's own. Natalie smiled for cameras, posed with elegance, attended gatherings with grace, but within she often felt the sting of stories told without her, about her, against her. And yet, perhaps paradoxically, gossip also sustained her fame. The world's fascination with her life kept her name alive even when roles grew scarce. The same whispers that wounded also ensured she remained in the public imagination, a figure both adored and speculated upon. Fame and rumor are entwined like vines, each feeding the other, and Natalie, though weary, could never entirely escape their entanglement. She sometimes wondered if this endless chatter obscured the truth of her. Did anyone see her as she truly was? A mother reading to her children, a woman reflecting quietly by the sea, a soul both tender and strong? Or did they only see fragments, distorted by rumor, magnified by distance? These questions lingered within her, feeding the quiet loneliness that even love and family could not fully erase. Still, she navigated these years with resilience, offering kindness even to those who whispered, maintaining dignity even when provoked. Friends spoke of her generosity, her ability to diffuse tension with a gentle word, her instinct to comfort rather than retaliate. She refused to harden herself, though the world gave her many reasons to do so. In this softness lay her strength, a refusal to let bitterness define her. The image that rises from these years is not of scandal itself, but of Natalie seated at a party, laughter surrounding her, a drink in her hand, listening as voices murmur around the room. She smiles, she converses, she dazzles, yet her eyes, if one looks closely, reveal something else, a watchfulness, a knowledge that the very air around her is filled with speculation. It is a smile that knows too much, a smile that carries both grace and fatigue. And always, beyond the noise of gossip, there was the sound she cherished most, the laughter of her children at home, pure and untouched by rumor. It was this sound that reminded her who she truly was, this sound that grounded her amid the swirling voices. Yet even that laughter could not wholly silence the whispers, for the world beyond the door always pressed near, rustling, insistent, unceasing. The whispers faded into the hush of a dressing room at night, where the dim glow of a candle flickered upon a table, strewn with scripts, mirrors, and brushes. In that wavering light, Natalie sat alone, her reflection softened by shadows, her face no longer for the cameras, but for herself. It was here, in these private moments, that she pondered the meaning of her work, her collaborations, her search for roles that offered more than glamour, that asked instead for truth. For beneath all the noise of gossip and all the demands of fame, she remained at heart an actress, one who longed for the alchemy that occurs when performance touches something eternal. In these years, she sought directors who could see beyond her beauty, who would challenge her, who would trust her to reveal depths that audiences might not expect. With Elia Kazan, she had already uncovered a rawness in splendor in the grass that astonished even herself. With other directors, she hoped for similar encounters, moments where art became not pretense but revelation. She understood well that not every role could offer such transformation, but she yearned for those rare chances when the script, the director, and her own heart aligned in a single current of authenticity. Often, however, the industry still looked upon her through the veil of her image. She was the luminous star, the delicate beauty, the tragic heroine. Scripts came that asked her to repeat these familiar patterns, to weep beautifully, to smile with grace, to embody vulnerability without demanding too much of the viewer. Natalie, ever professional, could deliver what was asked, yet within her lingered the desire to break free, to explore roles that carried edge, ambiguity, defiance. She was no longer the ingenue of the 1950s. She had lived, she had suffered, she had grown. Could cinema not give her space to reveal this? At times, she found resonance. In certain projects, she glimpsed the possibility of growth, of moving beyond type into something richer. She brought to these roles the weight of her experiences, the subtle layering of emotion that only one who has lived can offer. Viewers sensed it, even when critics failed to articulate it, the quiet authority that comes when vulnerability is tempered by endurance. She was not merely playing women, she was becoming them, shaping them with the truth of her own journey. Her collaborations with directors were often intense, for Natalie gave herself fully to the process. She listened, she absorbed, she asked questions. She sought to understand not just the surface of a character, but the invisible currents beneath. Some directors admired this, finding in her a partner in creation. Others underestimated her, mistaking her beauty for fragility, failing to see the intelligence that guided her craft. But those who truly worked with her, who allowed her space to explore, often spoke of her dedication, of the way she immersed herself, of the honesty she brought to each moment before the camera. And yet, in the solitude of the dressing room, she wondered if it was enough. Did her work truly matter? Or was it swallowed by the machinery of entertainment, consumed and forgotten like so many films? Did audiences remember the truth she offered, or only the shimmer of her face upon the screen? These questions burned quietly within her, illuminated by the candle's wavering flame, unresolved yet insistent. For Natalie, the search for meaning in her art was bound to the search for meaning in herself. Acting had been her life from childhood. It was the language through which she had learned to express what could not be spoken. But it was also the mask behind which she sometimes hid, the role she could never step away from entirely. In collaborating with directors, she sought not only to perfect her craft, but to uncover pieces of her own soul, to reconcile the star with the woman. There were nights when rehearsals left her exhausted, when lines blurred between character and self, when she returned home carrying the sorrow or joy of a role within her, long after the cameras stopped. Friends noticed how deeply she absorbed the emotions of her characters, how they lingered in her voice, in her gestures, in her silences. She did not act so much as inhabit, and in inhabiting, she gave of herself in ways that were both brilliant and costly. The candle flickered lower, the flame bending as if under the weight of her reflections. She thought of directors she still wished to work with, of scripts that might one day arrive, of the possibility of roles that would stretch her beyond even what she imagined. She thought of the young actresses rising now, bold and unrestrained, carving new paths in a changing Hollywood. Did she envy them, or did she see in them the continuation of her own longing? Perhaps both, for envy and admiration often share the same root. What endures from these quiet moments is not the list of films or names of collaborators, but the image of Natalie at her table, candlelight upon her face, eyes distant yet intent, as though searching the horizon of her own soul. The scripts before her are not merely words, they are mirrors, invitations, possibilities. She turns a page slowly, her fingers brushing the paper with reverence, as though touching not ink but destiny. And in that silence, filled with the faint scent of wax and powder, she asks herself again the question that has followed her since childhood: is what I give enough? The candle does not answer. The mirror reflects only her own gaze. The whispers of Hollywood fade into nothing. Only the flame remains, trembling, fragile, and enduring, like her own spirit in a world that too often saw only surface. The candle burned lower, and as its flame trembled out at last, the mirror in the darkened room remained uncovered, catching faint traces of light from the world outside. In that mirror, Natalie saw not only her reflection, but the unspoken pressures that had haunted her all her life. The weight of beauty, the relentless gaze of Hollywood, the cruel arithmetic of youth measured against time. For the industry that had embraced her as a child, adored her as a young woman, and celebrated her as a star, was also the same industry that now, with each passing year, looked upon her with quieter eyes, searching for signs of fading, waiting for some imperfection to appear. Natalie had always been praised for her beauty, for the luminous softness of her face, the vulnerability in her eyes, the delicacy of her form. But beauty, though adored, is also a cage, for it makes of a woman a symbol rather than a soul. People saw her face upon posters, her smile in magazines, her grace upon the screen, but how many paused to ask what lay behind those features? How many understood that the woman who seemed so flawless also carried within her the same insecurities as anyone, perhaps even sharper, sharpened by the knowledge that her livelihood depended upon the illusion of perfection? In her private moments, she sometimes looked into the mirror with unease, noting the faint lines beginning to appear, the subtle shifts of age. She was still young by any ordinary measure, still radiant, yet in Hollywood years the clock ticked faster, harsher, demanding that actresses remain eternally suspended in youth. Men could grow older and be praised for their maturity, their gravity, their power. Women, however, were expected to hold time still, to be forever the ingenue, the lover, the flawless beauty. And when time inevitably left its mark, the world turned its gaze elsewhere. Natalie knew this, for she had watched it happen to others. She had seen actresses once adored now passed over for fresher faces, their talents dismissed, their beauty judged as diminished. She dreaded this fate, not because she feared aging itself. There was dignity in the natural passage of years, but because she feared invisibility, the cruel silence that comes when the world no longer looks. For someone who had lived her entire life in the gaze of others, invisibility felt like erasure. She took care to preserve her appearance, to dress elegantly, to maintain the glow that audiences expected. It was not vanity, but survival, a recognition that in her world beauty was both shield and currency. Yet even as she did so, she questioned what it meant to be valued more for appearance than for depth. Did people love her performances because she revealed truth, or did they love simply to look upon her? Did they admire her for her craft, or for the illusion of eternal youth? The uncovered mirror reflected these questions back at her, silent and merciless. At times she smiled into it, reassuring herself that she remained luminous, that she could still enchant. At other times she looked away, weary of the endless dialogue between image and self. For a mirror tells only one kind of truth, the surface, while leaving the inner depths untouched. And Natalie longed always to be seen for more than the surface, to be understood for the heart she carried within. Hollywood's obsession with youth pressed upon her not only personally, but professionally. Roles offered to her grew fewer, and those that came often leaned upon her beauty, reducing her to ornament rather than complexity. She resisted, choosing carefully, declining what felt hollow, yet in declining she risked fading further from the industry's memory. It was a cruel choice, to accept roles that diminished her or to step back and risk silence. She walked this line with grace, but the tension gnawed at her. And beneath all this lay a deeper fear, one she had carried since childhood, the fear of water, the fear of drowning, the fear of depths unseen. Beauty itself, she sometimes felt, was like water, shimmering, fluid, captivating, yet capable of pulling one under. To live within the gaze of others was to swim constantly in uncertain seas, always at risk of sinking beneath the weight of expectation. She had survived thus far, buoyed by talent and will, but the waves pressed ever higher, whispering of fragility. Still, Natalie did not surrender. She remained a presence, her elegance undeniable, her grace intact. She attended events, appeared in interviews, accepted roles with dignity. Admirers still gazed upon her, still saw in her the luminous figure they had cherished for decades. But within her own heart, the mirror's reflection lingered, asking questions no applause could answer. Who was she beyond beauty? What would remain when the surface faded? Could she ever be seen fully, wholly as herself? The image that remains from this chapter is not of cameras or crowds, but of Natalie alone in her room, the mirror uncovered in darkness, her face lit faintly by a shaft of moonlight through the window. She studies her reflection not with vanity, but with quiet searching, as though trying to recognize herself beyond the image others had made of her. Her hand lifts to touch the glass, not to adjust, not to adorn, but to feel the cool surface, to reach for something beyond. The mirror reflects her touch back, offering no answers, only the endless silence of a surface. And in that silence, she turns away, leaving the mirror uncovered, its surface still shimmering faintly in the dark. Outside, the world waits with its relentless gaze, its judgments, its obsessions. Inside, she carries her questions quietly, unresolved, like the faint rustle of waves against the shore. The mirror in the darkened room reflected only silence, yet beyond the house the night carried another sound, deeper and more eternal, the rising and falling of waves against unseen shores. The sea, always there, always whispering, was to Natalie both cradle and abyss. From childhood she had feared water, had spoken often of her unease with its depths, its mystery, its ability to conceal what it swallowed. And yet the sea followed her life like a shadow, returning again and again, until at last it became inseparable from her story. It was aboard a yacht named Splendor that the ocean entered most vividly into her days, not merely as scenery but as presence, as witness, and perhaps as fate. The yacht was Robert Wagner's pride, a vessel of gleaming wood and white paint, a symbol of leisure and success. For Wagner, the Splendor was an escape from the relentless gaze of Hollywood, a place where he could entertain friends, where the horizon stretched wide and unconfined. For Natalie, the yacht was more complex. She admired its elegance, appreciated the sense of retreat it offered, yet the water beneath unsettled her, stirring memories of old fears, of childhood warnings, of stories her mother once told about destiny and drowning. She boarded the Splendor often, but always with a trace of caution, as though stepping onto a stage she did not wholly trust. Life aboard the yacht was filled with the rituals of companionship. Friends came and went, actors, writers, acquaintances from the world of film and beyond. There were dinners on deck, drinks poured beneath the stars, conversations carried by the sea breeze. Laughter echoed across the water, mingling with the sound of waves against the hull. To those who visited, it seemed idyllic, a picture of glamour and relaxation. But beneath the surface of these gatherings, as beneath the sea itself, there were currents less visible, tensions unspoken, emotions stirred by the closeness of confined space and the endless expanse around them. Natalie, poised and gracious, moved easily among the company, yet she often carried with her a faint unease. The sea stretched vast around them, its surface glittering in sunlight or silvered by moonlight, yet beneath lay darkness unfathomable. She could not look upon it without feeling both wonder and dread. Friends noticed her hesitation, her reluctance to linger too near the railings, her preference for the safety of the cabin. She joked at times about her fear, but her laughter was soft, uneasy, as though she wished to disarm the truth of it. The Splendor became a stage for moments both tender and stormy in her marriage. There were times of closeness when Wagner and Natalie, side by side, seemed to rediscover the companionship that had drawn them together twice in their lives. There were also quarrels, sharp words carried across the deck, silences heavy as anchors. The sea, impartial, bore witness to all of it, carrying away their voices into the night. It is said that Natalie sometimes confided her fear of water in ways that suggested more than simple anxiety. She spoke of premonitions, of a sense that the sea might one day claim her. Whether these words were serious or half in jest, no one can say with certainty, but those who heard them remembered. Such fears, once spoken, linger in memory, and when fate fulfills them, they return with haunting weight. The presence of the yacht in Natalie's life was not only literal, but symbolic. It embodied both the glamour of her world and the uncertainty beneath it. On deck, she entertained, smiled, played the role of hostess, admired for her elegance against the backdrop of sun and sea. Yet in her private thoughts, perhaps, she felt the sea pressing near, reminding her of fragility, of depths unseen, of endings unspoken. In photographs from those days, she appears radiant, seated on the deck, the wind in her hair, a glass in her hand, the horizon behind her. To the casual eye, it is perfection, a star at ease, a woman enjoying the fruits of success. But photographs capture only surfaces, and what lies beneath can never be framed. Did she, in those moments, feel the tug of her old fear? Did she glance at the water with unease even as she smiled for the camera? These are questions that can never be answered, yet they echo still, like waves upon the hull of memory. The image that remains from this chapter is not of parties or laughter, but of Natalie standing alone at the edge of the deck, the wind stirring her hair, her gaze fixed upon the endless horizon. Behind her, voices murmur, glasses clink, music drifts faintly. Before her, the ocean stretches dark and deep, each wave rising and falling like a breath too vast to comprehend. Her hand rests lightly upon the railing, not gripping, not trusting, only touching. Her eyes hold both beauty and unease, as though she senses that the sea is not merely backdrop but destiny, waiting with patient certainty. And in that moment, unresolved, the waves rise once more, falling into silence, carrying her gaze into the darkness that lies beyond the line where water meets sky. The waves rose and fell, carrying her gaze into the distance, and from that horizon time drifted forward to a late November evening in 1981, when the yacht Splendor once again cut across the waters, bound for Catalina Island. It was the long holiday weekend of Thanksgiving, a season meant for gratitude and gathering, yet on the deck of the yacht the air carried something else, a tension that lingered just beneath the surface of laughter. Glasses clinked in uneasy cheer, voices mingled with the sound of the sea, and Natalie, her husband Robert Wagner, and their guest, the actor Christopher Walken, sat together in a fragile triangle of companionship shadowed by unspoken currents. The Splendor, polished and gleaming, bore its company as it always had, offering the illusion of retreat, of escape from the world beyond. Yet the sea around Catalina is never still, its waters shifting, its winds capricious, its night sky vast and indifferent. Natalie had always felt unease upon these waters, her fear of drowning like a thread woven into her life. And now, as the yacht rocked gently at anchor, that unease seemed to grow heavier, though she smiled and played her role as hostess with practiced grace. The gathering was, on its surface, one of conviviality. There was food, there was drink, there was conversation between friends bound by the strange fellowship of Hollywood. Walken, younger than Wagner, brought with him an air of quiet intensity, a seriousness tempered by charm. He and Natalie were working together on a film, Brainstorm, and their camaraderie had been noted by many. To some, it seemed an innocent kinship of colleagues. To others, an intimacy that stirred Wagner's jealousy. Whatever its true nature, the perception was enough to seed unease, and that unease colored the evening like a shadow cast across candlelight. Natalie, ever attentive, moved between her husband and her guest, offering smiles, filling glasses, keeping the atmosphere afloat. Yet beneath her composure she must have felt the strain, the fragile balance between two men whose gazes met with currents unspoken. Wagner, proud and possessive, perhaps felt his place threatened. Walken, aloof yet magnetic, carried no intent to provoke, yet his very presence unsettled the delicate harmony of the marriage. And Natalie, caught between them, carried the burden of holding peace where peace could scarcely endure. The hours passed, the night deepened, and with it the weight of drink and words. Conversations sharpened, laughter thinned, silences grew heavier. What was said in those moments, what quarrels rose and fell, remains uncertain. Accounts differ, voices contradict, memories fracture. Some recall raised voices, others remember only tension. Still others insist that little was said at all. Truth, like the sea beneath them, became obscured in darkness, its depths unknowable. What is clear is that Natalie, at some point in that long night, withdrew from the company, retreating to her cabin or to the deck, seeking either solitude or escape. Her fear of water should have kept her far from the edges, yet somehow the sea would soon claim her. The clinking of glasses, once cheerful, now seemed hollow, as though echoing the fragility of bonds stretched too far. It is tempting to imagine her standing once more at the railing, gazing out into the dark expanse, the island's lights faint in the distance, the sea murmuring its eternal rhythm. Did she seek comfort in the night air, or did she step out with a heart weighed by unease? Did she long, in that moment, for silence beyond the quarrels, for peace beyond the whispers? The answers remain locked within the waves that carried her. The yacht, the island, the night, all these became more than setting. They became participants, witnesses to the unraveling of a story decades in the making. The ocean's breath carried every word, every silence into its depths, leaving behind only fragments for the world to piece together. The image that endures from this chapter is of three figures gathered in a small cabin, the air heavy with drink and words unsaid. Glasses raised but not in true celebration. The sound of crystal against crystal rings out clear and brittle, and in that sound lies the fragility of the moment, as though the smallest fracture might shatter the balance entirely. Outside, the sea waits, patient and vast, its waves rising and falling, indifferent to the dramas of men and women, yet ready, always, to receive what slips into its depths. And as the night deepens, the voices grow softer, until at last only the murmur of water remains, unresolved, carrying its secrets into darkness. The murmur of water surrounded the yacht, carrying the night deeper into silence. Yet within the splendor, the silence was not peace, but tension. Words had been spoken, some sharp, some slurred, and though no account agrees fully on what was said or how it was said, all agree that unease clung to the cabin like a heavy fog. Wagner and Walken, two men bound together only by Natalie's presence, drifted between conversation and confrontation, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of drink. Natalie, sensitive to every current, withdrew, retreating from the quarrels that seemed to swell with each passing hour. What precisely unfolded on that night of November the 28th, 1981, remains shrouded. Some recall shouting, others insist the arguments were mild. Some claim Wagner's jealousy flared, others that Walken spoke words too frank. The testimonies shift like the sea itself, each wave contradicting the last, leaving the truth submerged. But beneath all versions lies a common thread. Natalie left the company of the men, stepping into solitude. Whether she sought the refuge of her cabin, the coolness of the deck, or the quiet of night air, she departed from their presence, and in that departure the course of fate was sealed. She had always feared water. Since childhood she spoke of drowning, of the dread of dark depths. Friends and family remembered her unease, her insistence that she could not swim, her jokes that were not truly jokes. It is difficult, then, to imagine her choosing willingly to step into the night onto the small dinghy tied to the yacht, or to wander near the railings alone. Yet that is where she was last seen, near the edges of safety, near the very element she feared most. The yacht creaked softly as the tide shifted, ropes straining, the dinghy bumping faintly against the hull. The sounds of the sea were familiar to those who had sailed before, but to Natalie they must have carried menace, each splash a reminder of what she dreaded. Perhaps she stepped out only briefly to secure the lines, to escape the cabin's tension. Perhaps she lingered, hoping the night air might calm her, gazing at the island's faint glow in the distance. Perhaps, too, she carried within her a wish to be anywhere but there, between two men whose discord threatened the fragile fabric of her peace. The accounts diverge cruelly. Wagner later said they argued that harsh words passed between them before she left. Others said she and Walken had spoken quietly earlier in the evening, their closeness stirring Wagner's jealousy. The captain, Dennis Davern, recalled hearing quarrels, then silence, then Wagner absent from sight. The versions conflict, overlap, contradict, as though truth itself fractured with the night's events. In the end, what matters is only this: Natalie was alone upon the sea, unseen in her final moments. Sometime in those hours, unnoticed until too late, she slipped from the yacht's safety into the water. Whether by accident, by intent, or by something darker, no one can say. The Pacific received her silently, its surface closing above her, its depths swallowing her small cries if she made them. The sea, vast and indifferent, became her last stage, offering no audience, no applause, only darkness. One imagines her fear in that instant, the water cold against her, her body struggling, her voice perhaps rising but lost amid the wind. The dinghy, untied or loosed, drifted away, carrying with it the unanswered questions. The yacht remained anchored, its lights glowing faintly, its company oblivious until too late. Did anyone hear her? Did anyone stir as she slipped away? These questions remained suspended, heavy and unresolved, like anchors cast into waters too deep to retrieve. The night stretched onward, the company aboard the yacht at last realizing her absence. Searches were made, but she was already gone, already adrift in the dark. The sea gave no sign of her, holding her in its cold embrace until dawn. When her body was discovered, floating near the island's shore, clad in a red jacket and nightgown, the world awoke to the news that one of its most beloved stars had been silenced forever. But in this part of the story, we linger not on the discovery, but on the mystery. For the night itself, the hours between her departure from the cabin and the dawn that revealed her fate, remain clouded. Witnesses contradict, memories falter, and speculation grows. Did she stumble, attempting to quiet the dinghy that knocked against the hull? Did she fall while reaching for something, her fear realized in an instant? Did she walk away in anguish, seeking distance, only to be betrayed by the sea? Or was there more? Something unspoken, something hidden in silence? The truth lies beneath the waves, beyond reach. What remains is only absence, the silence after the splash, the emptiness upon the deck where she once stood. The quarrels ceased, the glasses emptied, the voices stilled. All that was left was the murmur of the ocean, patient and eternal, carrying her story into darkness. The image that endures from this night is not the moment of her fall, for no one saw it but the unseen movement itself. A figure stepping into shadow, the sound of water stirred, the yacht steady and oblivious. The island's lights flicker in the distance, unreachable. The sea rolls onward, calm upon the surface, unfathomable beneath. And Natalie, who had feared the water all her life, vanishes into it at last, leaving behind only questions, only silence, only the endless rhythm of waves. The night passed without witness, and when at last the horizon softened into dawn, the sea revealed what it had taken. The light spread slowly, pale and reluctant, gilding the surface of the Pacific with a sheen of silver. Gulls circled above the waters, their cries sharp against the morning stillness, as if calling attention to what lay below. And there, drifting near the rocky shore of Catalina, was Natalie's body, dressed still in the red jacket and nightgown, her hair spread like dark seaweed upon the water. The tide cradled her gently now, no longer threatening but indifferent, rocking her as if she were a child returned to some vast and merciless cradle. It was a fisherman who first glimpsed her, a figure floating where no figure should be. The alarm spread swiftly, summoning boats, officials, the Coast Guard. Soon the stillness of dawn was broken by engines, voices, the mechanical sounds of search and recovery. Yet all these noises seemed only intrusions upon the deeper silence, the silence that comes when life has already departed. On the Splendor, the company awoke to the news that confirmed what had been feared. Wagner, pale, distraught, unable to contain his grief, was said to weep openly. Christopher Walken, shaken and withdrawn, offered little. The captain, Dennis Davern, stood grim, his recollections already clouded by confusion and the haze of the night before. They looked upon the sea not as leisure but as betrayal, as if the waters themselves had conspired to steal what they cherished. The island stirred with activity, reporters drawn swiftly by rumor, locals murmuring in disbelief. A star was gone, not in the expected fading of years, but in the sudden silence of drowning. Natalie, who had lit the screen with her vulnerability, who had feared the ocean all her life, had met her end within it. The irony was cruel, almost mythic, as though fate had answered her lifelong dread with finality. Her body was carried from the sea with reverence, wrapped and shielded, yet the image could not be erased, the smallness of her form against the vastness of the ocean, the fragility of life beside the endless horizon. In that moment, the glamour of Hollywood was stripped away, leaving only the truth that she was a woman, mortal, tender, lost to the same elements that claim all beings in time. News spread swiftly to the mainland. By morning, headlines blazed across papers, radios spoke with solemn tones, and television anchors recounted the sparse facts. Audiences, still digesting their holiday feasts, now swallowed grief. They remembered her as Maria, as Deanie, as the child in Miracle on 34th Street. They remembered her eyes, always luminous, always vulnerable, now closed forever. In homes across the world, people paused, shocked that someone who had seemed eternal on screen could vanish in the indifferent Pacific. The investigation began at once, yet answers proved elusive. Officials noted bruises on her body, scratches that might have been from the fall, from the rocks, from desperate struggle. The dinghy was found adrift, its motors silent, its purpose uncertain. Wagner's testimony was fractured by grief, Walken's guarded by distance, Davern's shifting with time. The official ruling was accident, an attempt to quiet the restless speculation, but the silence around the truth only deepened the questions. And so, even as her body was laid upon the shore, even as her family wept and prepared for burial, mystery clung to her story. How did she, so afraid of water, find herself alone upon its surface? Why did no one hear her cries, if she cried at all? What words were spoken in the cabin before she left? Was it accident, misstep, choice, or something darker? The sea offered no reply, only the endless repetition of waves against stone. Her daughters, too young to grasp the full weight, would grow into their grief slowly, piecing together fragments of memory and story. Wagner, broken, would carry the burden of suspicion and sorrow for the rest of his days. Walken, though less pursued, would remain forever tied to that night, his silence speaking as loudly as any words. The captain, caught between guilt and uncertainty, would tell and retell his version, each time slightly different, as though memory itself conspired to confuse. Yet for those who loved her, and for the millions who admired her from afar, the details mattered less than the loss. Natalie was gone, taken in the prime of her life, leaving behind roles yet to be played, children yet to be raised, questions yet to be answered. She had been more than a star. She had been a presence, a reminder of vulnerability, a mirror of longing. Now she was memory, drifting forever in the minds of those who had gazed upon her. The image that lingers from that dawn is not the commotion of officials nor the flashing of cameras, but the stillness of the ocean itself. Vast and unfeeling, the gulls wheel above, their cries sharp and insistent. The water glimmers faintly, reflecting the new sun, and in that expanse lies the truth of mortality, that beauty, fame, love, and fear all dissolve at last into silence, into the embrace of elements that do not discriminate between star and stranger. The gulls circle once more, their wings catching the light, before they vanish into the distance. The waves continue their rhythm as they always have, as they always will. And in that rhythm, Natalie's story drifts unresolved, a melody broken yet still echoing, carried upon waters that keep their secrets forever. The gulls wheeled away into the morning light, their cries fading, and in their place rose the solemn murmur of voices gathered in mourning. News of Natalie's death had spread with the swiftness of a tide, and Hollywood, stunned and disbelieving, moved quickly to honor her passing. The city that had raised her from childhood into stardom now prepared to lay her to rest, its mourning marked not only by tears, but by cameras, not only by silence, but by spectacle. For in Hollywood, grief itself becomes performance, and even the farewell of a beloved actress must unfold beneath the public gaze. Her funeral was held in Los Angeles, where the air, though bright with sun, seemed heavy with sorrow. Friends, colleagues, admirers all gathered in black, their faces drawn with disbelief. Elizabeth Taylor came, her eyes veiled but glistening. Laurence Olivier sent words of tribute. Frank Sinatra, Gregory Peck, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly. All the names of the silver screen appeared in attendance, each carrying flowers, each carrying memories. The chapel was filled with fragrance, lilies and roses, intermingling, their sweetness tinged with grief. Robert Wagner, stricken with sorrow, walked ahead of the coffin, his face pale, his grief visible in every step. He held the hands of Natasha and Courtney, their small forms bewildered by the magnitude of loss they could not yet comprehend. The sight of the children stirred the deepest ache in those who gathered, a reminder that behind the legend of Natalie Wood was a mother, torn from her daughters too soon. The coffin itself was a stark reminder of mortality. Polished wood gleaming under the lights carried within it not a star, but a woman, fragile and human, whose eyes would no longer reflect light, whose voice would no longer tremble with feeling. As it was borne down the aisle, a hush fell over the chapel, broken only by the sobs of those who had known her most intimately. Outside, the crowds gathered, pressing close, their grief mingling with curiosity. Reporters stood with cameras poised, capturing images that would appear in papers the next day. Wagner's bowed head, Natasha's bewildered gaze, Taylor's tearful expression. For even in mourning, Hollywood could not escape the lens, and Natalie's passing became both personal tragedy and public story. The streets beyond the chapel were lined with strangers, admirers who had never met her, yet felt they knew her, for her face and voice had accompanied them through their lives. They brought flowers, photographs, notes, laying them down as offerings at the chapel gates. The service was filled with words of remembrance, of tributes to her artistry, of reflections upon her vulnerability and grace. Friends spoke of her kindness, her generosity, her laughter in private moments, her devotion as a mother. Directors praised her commitment, her willingness to give herself fully to every role. Actors recalled her warmth on set, the way she eased tensions, the way she made all feel welcome. The words rose and fell like waves of memory, each one carrying a piece of her forward, even as her body lay silent. Yet amid the reverence, whispers continued. How had she fallen? Why had she been alone? What quarrels had transpired that night? The questions, unanswered, hung heavy in the air, casting shadows even upon her farewell. For many, grief was mingled with suspicion, sorrow with unease. It was as though the mystery of her death intruded upon the sanctity of mourning, refusing to allow peace. Still, the service proceeded with solemn dignity. The coffin was lowered into the ground, surrounded by roses, the petals falling like drops of blood upon the earth. Voices rose in prayer, some whispered, some trembling. The children clung to their father, their small hands gripping his as though anchoring themselves against a world that had suddenly grown unsteady. And when the final words were spoken, when the coffin was sealed beneath the soil, a silence fell, deep and vast, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The days that followed were filled with tributes, with retrospectives, with images of Natalie's life replayed endlessly on screens. Films were shown again, her roles revisited, her beauty remembered. Magazine covers bore her face, headlines proclaimed her tragic end, talk shows speculated upon the mystery. Hollywood, ever hungry for story, transformed her passing into narrative, weaving sorrow into entertainment, grief into spectacle. Yet for those closest to her, there was no spectacle, only the raw absence of her presence, the echo of her laughter now silent, the chair at the table empty. In Wagner's home, the children's cries filled the nights. Friends came with casseroles, with embraces, with futile words of comfort. In her mother Mariah's heart, old griefs mingled with new, for she had once feared this very fate, had once spoken warnings of water, and now her prophecy seemed fulfilled. For her daughters, the loss was not of a star, but of a mother's arms, a mother's voice, a mother's love, stolen too soon. The image that lingers from this chapter is of the funeral procession, leaving the chapel, the coffin borne slowly into sunlight. The crowd stands in stillness. The photographers raise their cameras. The air is heavy with perfume and sorrow. Above, the gulls wheel once more, as if returning from the sea, their cries echoing faintly. And in that sound lies the reminder that life, however adorned with fame, ends always in the same silence, leaving behind only memory, only questions, only the faint trace of wings against the sky. The gulls wheeled above the funeral procession, their cries fading into the distance, and when their sound was gone, what remained was not peace, but questions. Questions whispered in hallways, questions printed in columns, questions murmured in living rooms as audiences replayed her films with new eyes. The official word had been spoken, accidental drowning, a misstep on a dark night. But the story did not rest within those narrow lines. Shadows lingered around her death, contradictions in testimony, fragments that did not fit, silences too heavy to ignore. Thus began the long unfolding of investigations, inquiries, revisions, and doubts, each seeking to grasp a truth that remained elusive as the sea itself. The authorities at first concluded swiftly. Natalie had been drinking. The night was late. The dinghy had come loose, and in her attempt to secure it, she must have fallen, her heavy jacket dragging her under. It was a tidy explanation, one that satisfied the formality of record-keeping, one that aligned with the simplest possibility. Yet for those who knew her, for those who remembered her lifelong fear of water, the conclusion felt hollow. How could she, who avoided even stepping near the yacht's edges, have ventured out alone into the night to tend a rope? How could her silence have gone unheard until dawn? The captain of the Splendor, Dennis Davern, struggled with his conscience. In the early days, he echoed the official line, speaking cautiously, aligning with Wagner's account. Yet as years passed, his story shifted, his memories reshaping into claims of quarrels, of tension, of arguments that spilled beyond words. He suggested that Wagner and Natalie had fought bitterly that night, that Walken withdrew, that anger and jealousy marked the hours before she vanished. He implied that the truth was not accident but tragedy born of human conflict, though whether by intent or by misfortune he left unclear. Wagner, when asked, maintained his grief but rejected suspicion. He spoke of Natalie with love, of his devastation at her loss, of the cruelty of those who sought scandal in sorrow. He insisted upon accident, upon the simplicity of fate. Walken, for his part, withdrew into silence, rarely speaking of that night, his words brief and guarded when pressed. This silence only deepened speculation, for absence of speech often invites louder questions. The coroner's report noted bruises, abrasions, signs that could have come from the fall into water or from a struggle before it. At first, these details were dismissed as incidental, the ordinary marks of accident. Yet in time, as Davern's changing testimony revived interest, these details were revisited, given weight anew. The case was reopened decades later, the death certificate amended to reflect not simply accident, but drowning and other undetermined factors. Even then, certainty eluded investigators. The sea had kept its secrets, and the witnesses, whether unwilling or unable, offered no definitive truth. And so Natalie's death became less an event than a riddle. Each retelling shifted, each article reframed the night. Some painted Wagner as jealous, others Walken as aloof. Others still insisted upon simple mischance. The public, hungry for answers, debated endlessly, yet no resolution came. Her story joined the pantheon of Hollywood mysteries, a tale of beauty lost too soon, of circumstances unresolved, of truth buried beneath speculation. For those closest to her, these questions were cruel. Her daughters grew up in the shadow of suspicion, their grief entwined with public curiosity. Wagner, whatever his truth, lived beneath the cloud of doubt, his love for Natalie forever overshadowed by whispers. Friends spoke with caution, unwilling to accuse, unwilling to absolve. The industry, too, stood divided, some calling for justice, others for quiet respect. In this division, Natalie's memory was stretched, reshaped, distorted by the very world that once adored her. Yet beyond the suspicion lies the enduring fact. A woman feared water all her life and met her end within it. Whether by fate, by accident, or by human failing, her prophecy came true. The sea, which had haunted her dreams, became her final resting place. That irony is as cruel as any myth, a story told again and again because it refuses resolution. Investigations, no matter how official, could not soothe the unease. For truth in human affairs is seldom neat, memory falters, motives obscure, silence distorts. And so the mystery remains, not in documents, but in imagination, in the questions we continue to ask when her films play, when her name is spoken, when her story is recalled. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between accident and intention, between silence and confession, forever beyond reach. The image that endures from this chapter is not of courtrooms or papers, but of a file left open upon a desk, pages spread with notes, photographs, diagrams of the yacht, testimonies marked with lines and doubts. The desk lamp glows, illuminating words that do not resolve, arrows that circle back, margins filled with question marks. Beyond the window, the night is quiet, the sea invisible but near, its murmur faint in the distance. The investigator leans back, weary, staring at the page, knowing that no matter how carefully he examines, the truth has already slipped beyond grasp, carried away by waves that answer to no one. And so the file remains open, unresolved, a symbol of all that cannot be known. The case, like the sea, resists closure, leaving behind only fragments, speculation, and the ache of uncertainty. The file remained open upon the desk, its pages unsettled, its margins marked with unanswered questions. And beyond the silence of investigation, there arose another sound, softer yet enduring, the whirring of an old projector as reels of film turned once more. For though her death was mystery, her life remained etched in light and celluloid, preserved in the flickering images that played across screens long after she was gone. It was in these images that generations sought to remember her, to reconcile sorrow with beauty, to preserve what life itself could not. The projector's hum filled darkened rooms, casting beams of light upon blank walls, and there appeared again the child Natalie, wide-eyed in miracle on 34th Street, her innocence both tender and precocious. Audiences watched and felt the tug of nostalgia, remembering their own childhoods, their own Christmases, as though she embodied not merely a character, but the very memory of belief itself. Then the reels turned forward, and she was a teenager in Rebel Without a Cause, standing beside James Dean, her vulnerability mirroring the restless spirit of an age. The youth who had once watched her with kinship grew older, revisited the film, and saw anew the poignancy of young lives searching, yearning, breaking. The whirring continued, and the screen filled with color, with music, with the tragic sweetness of West Side Story. There she was as Maria, her eyes luminous with first love, her voice, though dubbed, carried by the purity of her presence, her movements fragile against the chaos of violence around her. Audiences wept again for a love doomed by fate, and in her performance they felt the timeless sorrow of hearts torn by forces beyond their control. Then came splendor in the grass, and Deanie's trembling breakdown, her sobs raw, her longing unbearable, her fragility turned into art that transcended its time. Here was Natalie at her most unguarded, offering herself wholly to the role, transforming her own hidden sorrows into a mirror for others. Each film became, in retrospect, not only performance but prophecy, each role reflecting fragments of her own life, the innocence of youth, the yearning of adolescence, the vulnerability of love, the fragility of beauty. To watch her was to witness not merely an actress but a soul unfolding, shaped by the paradox of art and reality. Critics and scholars revisited her work, writing essays, speaking on panels, exploring how her image had shifted with time. Some praised her versatility, her ability to embody both strength and weakness. Others focused on the cultural resonance of her roles, how they captured the anxieties of mid-century America, the transitions of gender and youth. But all agreed that her presence was unmistakable, that she carried on screen a truth that could not be faked. For the public, her films became memorials, ways of keeping her alive. Fans gathered in theaters for retrospectives, whispering her lines along with the screen, applauding not only the stories, but the memory of her. Young audiences, too, discovered her anew, astonished that someone from decades past could feel so immediate, so real. The whirring of projectors gave way to the clicks of VHS tapes, then to the glow of DVDs, then to the invisible streams of digital files. Yet her presence endured, crossing generations as effortlessly as light crosses darkness. Her daughters, growing older, saw in her films a mother preserved in youth, forever radiant, forever vulnerable. For them, the images were both comfort and ache, reminders of what they had lost and what the world had shared. Wagner, too, must have watched at times, his grief entangled with the glow of her image, his love and sorrow renewed each time her eyes met his across the screen. For friends and colleagues, the films were both testament and torment, proof of her brilliance and reminders of her absence. As years passed, Natalie's legacy grew not only through her films, but through the stories told of her. Biographies appeared, documentaries were made, interviews replayed. Each sought to capture her essence, yet each in its way fell short, for no life can be fully contained in words or reels. What endured most powerfully was not analysis, but memory. The simple image of her face upon the screen, the way her eyes seemed to speak directly to those who watched, as though she knew their secrets, as though she shared her own. In revisiting her films, audiences found not closure, but continuity. The questions of her death lingered, unresolved, but her life shone still in art. To watch her was to feel her presence, to be reminded that beauty and sorrow often walk together, that vulnerability is a form of strength, that truth can be conveyed in the tremble of a voice, the glance of an eye. Natalie's gift was not only her talent, but her willingness to reveal, to offer herself wholly, even when it left her exposed. That offering remains, flickering in light, undimmed by time. The image that endures from this chapter is of an old projector in a darkened theater, the reels spinning steadily, the beam of light cutting through dust motes in the air. On the screen, Natalie appears once more, smiling, weeping, gazing with eyes that seem to pierce the veil between art and life. The audience sits in silence, some remembering, some discovering, all drawn into her presence. The whirring continues, steady, patient, as though the machine itself knows that in preserving her image, it preserves something of her spirit. And when the reel ends, when the screen fades to black, the silence that follows is filled not with absence, but with memory, with the lingering echo of her voice, her gaze, her life. The projectors were slowed, the reel coming to its end, and in the silence that followed, there arose again the sound more ancient than film, more enduring than applause, the sea, eternal, patient, indifferent. It was in the sea that Natalie's life had found its final chapter, and it is to the sea that memory always returns, as though her story cannot be told without the murmur of waves. The ocean, vast and unknowing, had shadowed her from childhood fears to adult unease, and at last it had taken her. Yet even in taking, it offered no clarity, no resolution, only the endless rhythm of rising and falling, like questions that can never be answered. The sea does not explain, it does not testify, nor confess, nor absolve. It receives, it conceals, it carries away. In this, it resembles memory itself, holding fragments without order, keeping truths half hidden. Natalie's death remains such a fragment, known in part, felt in full, but never fully explained. And perhaps that is fitting, for her life, too, was a tapestry of paradoxes. Beauty that concealed sorrow, fame that carried loneliness, love entwined with jealousy, vulnerability that became strength. To end in mystery is to echo the very nature of her existence. In remembering her, we do not find conclusions but reflections. We see her as the child star, her tears coaxed for the camera. We see her as the teenager beside James Dean, mirroring a generation's confusion. We see her as Maria, as Deanie, as the luminous woman whose gaze seemed always to hold both innocence and ache. We see her as wife, as mother, as friend, as a soul seeking peace amid the noise of fame. And we see her at last upon the sea, her life broken by waters she had feared, her story carried beyond reach. Each image rises like a wave, glimmers briefly, then fades, leaving behind only the echo of its passage. For those who loved her, the questions remain sharp. For the world that admired her, they remain haunting. Did she stumble by accident, a misstep into the depths? Did quarrels sharpen into tragedy? Did the silence conceal more than was spoken? No answer satisfies, for each possibility contains sorrow, and sorrow resists resolution. We are left instead with ambiguity, with the knowledge that human lives, however luminous, seldom resolve like stories. They end in fragments, in mysteries, in silences that linger long after the final word. And yet, in that ambiguity, something remains. Her films still speak, her image still glows, her presence still touches those who watch. She is not gone entirely. She exists in the shimmer of light upon screens, in the voices of those who remember, in the hearts of those who see, in her vulnerability, a mirror of their own. This, perhaps, is the truest legacy. Not clarity, but connection. Not conclusion, but the endurance of feeling. The sea, too, connects. It binds shores. It carries currents. It links past and present. In its vastness lies the reminder that all lives are small against eternity, yet no life is without meaning. Natalie's story, with its brilliance and tragedy, its triumphs and mysteries, flows now into that larger sea of memory, where it mingles with countless others, yet still retains its distinct shimmer, like a single wave marked by the moon. The image that remains is of the ocean at dusk, the horizon painted with fading light, the waves gentle yet ceaseless. Upon the water lies a silence deeper than sound, a silence that holds within it both grief and beauty. The sea does not speak, yet it reminds. It does not explain, yet it endures. And in its endurance, we hear something of her story. Not an ending, not an answer, but an echo, eternal and unresolved. So let us leave her there. Upon the water she both feared and met. Her memory carried by waves, her presence flickering in light, her story drifting between remembrance and dream. And as we listen to the sea, to its endless rhythm, we too drift gently, not toward certainty, but toward rest.